5. So we are left with only 1 hour. So what can I do, which is in my hand? I can skip my formal, formal discussion situating this session, this plenary session. There is no question of it. I talked a lot on the first day. And we have 3 speakers here. And so I would request them to finish within 15 minutes. Otherwise, we can't manage it within 1 hour time. And unfortunately, we shall not be able to give the audience a chance to raise questions. They can discuss the questions, the points with the speakers, the relevant speaker outside. So, over to Dr. Shubhranshu Shekhar Misra, who is former Dean, National Defense Academy, Pune, and he did his PhD, as he told me just now, from Jawaharlal Nehru University in the field of geopolitics. Over to Dr. Shubhranshu Shekhar Misra.
Yeah, Jai Jagannath, Bande Utkal Janani, Kali Jai Kalinga. Good morning to everyone. So, with the paucity of time, I will just get straight to my paper. That is India and the region of Indo-Pacific, the strategic perspectives. 2 more things just I'll point out in the heading. So one is strategy. Many of you are not aware. Strategy is the level strata. It is from the word stratum to strata, strategic. Every country has these 3 broad strategic: economic, political, and military. So it is all enmeshed, and broadly for any country, when it goes for overall its power projection or its whole relations with the outside world, it has to maintain all these interests in broader strategic terms. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is the Indo-Pacific region, how India is located at the center of this Indo-Pacific region, because the whole vast waters of Indian Ocean, which is straddling the Indian subcontinent, the concept of rimland under geopolitics, and stretching up to the island nations of Pacific, the microstates of all these smaller islands in the Pacific, they are also located. And we have great, as we discussed in the last previous sessions of the seminar, we have how great cultural relations with these smaller countries. But more important is, I'll get down to the job of the current perspective, how these countries are important in the context of India's rise as a major power. You have to understand, we have different concepts, middle power and major power. And in the trinity of Asian powers, you have China, Japan, and India. Broadly, these are the 3 major powers in economic, political, and military terms. Japan, the biggest economy, largest economy among the 3. And we have emerged as a techno-economic power in recent decades. And that's how this whole region of Indo-Pacific, where America has withdrawn from this area, but still, earlier it was a resident power, so it wants to get engaged with different balancing acts. You have a balance of power. So India, Japan, Australia, and US, they are all coming together, which I'll just flag off in the next slides. So this is the the importance of the geopolitics and geoeconomics because of the global trade and the large number of sea lines of communication, flourishing trade and economy. Okay, because how there's 62% of the world GDP is virtually furnished from this region, and how merchandise trade and sea lines of communication. Then there is the threat of all those high sea piracy, fishing, trafficking, and all these things. And this region has been very, very vital in present times. And how this coinage of the word Indo-Pacific, it has come from the 2007 Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to his address to Indian Parliament, and he only propagated this idea of Indo-Pacific, which was further carried on by Australia, and US finally gave the shape in 2017. This idea from Asia-Pacific, the shift to Indo-Pacific. So this is the military dimension, as I was giving you the broader hint. Earlier, Europe was very important, but European economies are on decline. Europe is almost declined because of their human resources and all that. So Asia, this is the Asian century, as we have been highlighted in the previous sessions. So this region is also very strategic importance. Who only, as Mackinder and others, geopolitics experts, they have said, who only controls the sea lanes, he controls the economic and military power. And US has been, for your information, I hope most of you know, US Navy is the largest service among its three services. US Navy, because it's a global power, because of its Navy. So unless you don't improve your naval strategy, you cannot improve your military strength abroad. So next important is for India's concern, this is this China factor. Because China has this very common approach that Chinese philosophy, it says, in one mountain there cannot be two mice. So that's how it wants to dominate India in this Asian canvas of power projection. Japan is, as you know, Japan is not a military power. It's after the Second World War, it has gone for a pacifist constitution. Of course, the new generation wants to go out of the US dependence, and they want to build up their own strategic autonomy. So the China factor is very important, and because there is currently, of course, after the COVID pandemic and all that, China's economic and production, everything has come down. And virtually India has gained a lot because of that. But broader, China has pursued these policies of Belt and Road Initiative, investment in all the countries, and put countries in the debt burden, like Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, you must have read from the newspaper, at least the general audience which you are following day to day, current events abroad. So you find that how the Chinese have almost created so many problems for the smaller countries, that their more interest is military interest, because they want to control the sea lines of communications for their trade and commerce. So then with the Southeast Asian countries, there are so many issues. I hope there is South Asian experts who will take up these issues of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, vis-a-vis China, how they have to adjust to the rising China. In fact, the ASEAN countries wants India as the balancer, to India to balance China. So these are the major ports and Chinese bases, military involvement in the region, where, and how Chinese are trying to, control the whole region of Asia Pacific. That's how Americans have taken it very seriously, and they have given a great push to India, which I'll just come in the next slides. Then what are the broad objectives of India in the Indian Ocean region? So primarily, India is a peace-loving country, as we have highlighted as in our cultural dimensions in the context of the main conference here. But right now, India has to assert its strategy broadly in economic terms. Unless you have this broader interest, how it has to expand its presence, both economic, of course, it was driven economic. Now military is very important. And coming from having expertise in defense and security issues, so there I'll go for how India has to build up its military interest along with the other countries. The hedging strategy. Hedging strategy is something you go along with your interest to have good relations with the countries. Like if I give you a simple example for the general audience, we have in the context of Ukraine war, we have bought all the crude oil from Russia, but we are not supporting the Russian intervention in Ukraine. So that's a very strategy, and we have got almost 30% discount the oil. As you know, India has to buy 60% of its oil from abroad. So it's a great diplomacy. That's the economic diplomacy. We have played our cards very carefully under the present government. So that is how we are also going along with our broader military strategy. See, these are the very smaller countries. This is the Pacific Island countries. Recently, Prime Minister Modi went to Papua New Guinea, and there was this whole big conference over there with the FinCEN countries. All the countries they joined, and in fact, they were earlier moving more closer towards China. Now they have realized, because here also during the COVID, India has done tremendous work providing so-called the medical emergency supplies to these countries. And you can see, you remember the photo where Papua New Guinea Prime Minister comes down and he touches the feet of the Prime Minister, Modi. So that's what the level of India's involvement, even in these micro-states, very small countries, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu and all this. There is some of the French colonies are there. French Melanesia is there, where French are pushing for India's role in the Indo-Pacific. We are getting support from UK. Of course, US is the greatest power, supported by France and UK. So then, the India's naval strategy. This is very important. So we have virtually, we are building up our navy as a blue water navy. And in fact, there is a problem coming from defense area. I would not, but I can just share with you, in India we have neglected our navy at the expense of Air Force and Army. Of course, if modern terms, modern wars have to be won by only air power. That's true. That's how India is looking for only more this Rafale and all that. Because modern wars will be fought for just 8 to 10 hours. It will be finished with India-China, not about Ukraine and Russia. That's a different war. That's a territorial war. So that's how we have neglected our navy. So we need more submarines, more aircraft carriers, corvettes and all that. So there is how maritime domain awareness and how India has gone for joint exercises. That's important. We have joined with Australian Navy. Australia is a very important Pacific country which wants India to play a dynamic role, because there is as Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says, diamond of democracies. That is Japan, Australia, and India. They should come together, and they have the joint interest of maintaining the rule-based order in Indo-Pacific. That's where the focus is. So all these issues of ASEAN, India's relationship with countries, BIMSTEC and all that. Then this is very important. Where I am coming, you must be aware, quadrilateral maritime, that's in the security dialogue, where these 4 countries, as you know, US, Japan, Australia and India. Japan is a great economic power. Still, its techno-economy, its R&D, research is supporting Americans. Though they are not building up arms, but their research is going for the Americans. And where Japan is a very strong supporter of India. So this is how we have carried out with the naval exercises in the Pacific Rim countries. Then Americans have been very, very forthcoming in transferring some of the technologies in recent and the last visit also you have come across. Then these are the broader agreement, LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, COMCASA, that is Communication Information Security Memorandum. Now American ships can pass on the information to Indian naval ships when they are in the high seas. That's a very major agreement, and whereby, in fact, Chinese are very much scared of this because Americans are coming close to India. So these are the U.S. military presence in Indo-Pacific, and where, whereby wherever there is port of call, Indian ships can go and they can. So this is the Pacific Command, and Americans is the largest command, Pacific Command. As you know, for Afghanistan, for your general information, as you know, you have the Central Command, CENTCOM forces in Diogo Garcia. Within 25 minutes, the American forces can reach Afghanistan, just 23 to 25 minutes. They have to just take the airborne, to be airborne from Diogo Garcia. That's how these are broader, the contours of, India's foreign policy projection and the strategic interest. So if there is any questions or clarification, I'll come forward to help you. Thank you.
Next up, we have an address by Dr. Abubakar Ebihara, sir, who is an associate professor. He will be joining us online.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abubakar Ebihara. I'm sorry I cannot attend the conference directly, so I use this technology to present my paper. First of all, I would like to thank Prof. Atit Misra, who invited me to present my paper. Please allow me to share my PowerPoint here. So the title of my presentation is about India and ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. As we know that there has been a kind of tension in Indo-Pacific after the rise of China, as has been mentioned by the first speaker this morning. So some argue that the rise of China is not a benign rise, and many countries were still left confused about the direction of the China rise. So with this background, then 4 countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, set up Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogues. So in response to this tension and also the formation of Quad, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, launched its vision about the region called ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, or AOIP. So in this outlook, ASEAN wants to make sure that there has been the continuation of security, stability, and cooperation, and also ASEAN wants to continue its roles to create regions of dialogue in the region. So there has been a kind of worries that Quads may go in a different direction than ASEAN aspires. So it may become a security alliances, and it can be increase the tension in the region. So this conference has relevant in this context. I think we have discussed a lot about the history of relation between India and Southeast Asia. So history is a kind of soft power that can tie back fears of stretching relationship, and also civilizational linkage carry word that can build better relationships. So in this presentation, there has been 4 points that I want to discuss regarding the ASEAN worried about the Quad, about this alliance between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. These four aspects are historical and cultural ties between India and Southeast Asia, the peaceful spread of Indian civilization, pre-India's foreign policy history, and Indian soft power in Southeast Asia. So I will try to explain these aspects one by one. And with regard to the first aspects, I think this first aspect is very important with regard to the relation between India and Southeast Asia. So these historical and cultural things, if we understand this aspect, I think the Southeast Asian countries should not worry about the Quad. We know that the relationship between India and Southeast Asia has been going on for quite a long time. Before Islamic civilization and Western civilization spread to Southeast Asia region, Indian civilization has spread over. So according to academics from India, Amitabh Acharya, this civilization spread was conducted through the so-called Nirvana route, because the civilization brought by India was based on the teaching of Buddhism and Hinduism. Kalinga route was also an important part of this route. So the influence of Indian culture, as we know, continues until today, reflected in the music, movies, and also arts, I think, yeah. And the second aspect that may increase relation between India and Southeast Asia is that we see the civilizational links, as we have discussed in these few days. So the diffusion of values of Indian civilization was carried out in a peaceful way and underwent a localization process in which new values were adapted to local cultural contexts. So this is different from the expansion of Western civilization that came with colonializations. For example, in a book written by Heather Bull and Adam Watson, titled Expansion of International Society. So in this book, it is explained how the colonized countries must adapt to modern state principles such as the nation-state system, the principle of state sovereignty, liberal democracy, human rights, and liberal economy. So former colonial countries only can increase their status and be equal to Western countries if they have succeeded in adopting a modern state system with all its aspects. Some writers indeed call the spread of Indian culture, norms, and values in Southeast Asia with the term colonializations. However, this term is very debatable because Indian kingdoms like Kalinga did not occupy the areas and they did not exploit the people over there. So the spread of Indian civilization was very complex, such as through trade, the spread of religion by the clergy and scientists who then made local people interested in studying Indian civilization. The local people then applied the teaching, in particular religious teaching, become a powerful legitimacy for power. So in such a historical context, India's rise, for example, should be seen as a benign rise, not as something to be feared like the rest of China. And another aspect that I want to discuss is Indian foreign policy traditions. So Indian international figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru became a source of inspiration for third world independence. Nehru was a figure who laid the foundation of India's independent and free foreign policy. Indians supported Indonesian independence in various international forums in 1940s. Also, India pioneered the non-alignment movement and supported the Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung. More importantly, during the Cold War, India did not agree to a defense pact like SEATO. This principle also is reflected in India's views of Quad now, India has officially stated that Quad is not developing into a defense alliance. So in other words, India tradition of non-alignment is in line with the principle of ASEAN cooperation. And last part, why Southeast Asia should not worry with the Quad alliance is because India has a lot of interest in Southeast Asia. India's soft power is also quite strong in Southeast Asia. India has an interest in maintaining the popularity of its soft power, like Indian songs, yoga, movies, and music. So, and this all soft power has huge economic benefits for India. And for that reason as well, relations with ASEAN are contained, for example, in the Act Look East policy. So, in conclusions, with some of the reason above, the desire of ASEAN VOIP is also part of the Indian interest. So the continuation of Indian-ASEAN cooperation is urgent to be maintained and supported. In the historical context we discussed above, the rise of India can be said to be more benign than the rise of China. Okay, thank you. That's my presentation. Good morning.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Bakar, for your presentation. We are running short of time. That's why we couldn't give you longer time. It's nice to have you here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I invite Dr. Rajshekhar Basu over to Aditi for introduction. Okay.
Now we have an address by Dr. Rajshekhar Basu sir, who is a professor in the Department of History in the University of Calcutta.
A very good morning to all of you. And I'm very thankful to my colleagues here in Utkal University for having invited me, especially Professor Padi. I had the opportunity of speaking to him several times over the telephone. And I'm also happy that my former senior colleague, Professor Shriti Kumar Sharkar, whom I have known for more than 30 years as a young man, when I was young, he's there to chair the session. And I'm equally beholden to my co-panelists, who have actually spurred some bit of ideas as to what I can do in the 10 minutes or so that I have at hand. Now, from yesterday, we've been hearing these very catchwords: look east, ahead east, Indian colonization, whether it was benign or whether it was aggressive. And certainly, all these discussions have a meaning to me, because I'm not from the field of strategic studies or international relations. I remain a more conventional historian, and my first encounter with Southeast Asia came when I was a master's student, but more when I started doing my research in the Tamil Nadu archives. And these were the days where I actually came across a lot of files, documents on labor migration. Essentially, I've written on plantation economy. And I was so much interested that twice I was selected for the Asian Scholarship Foundation to work on the Adi Dravidas. There in Malaysia, twice the situation in Malaysia was so turbulent, especially with the Indian population there, I couldn't go for any field work. My cohorts were not willing to house me there because the Malaysian government was very, very stringent as to why an Indian scholar should be probing into Indian population. But this was certainly not the scene when in the 1920s a lot of people went there on fact-finding mission. But having said all this, I believe that whenever we talk about Southeast Asia-India connections, naturally we go back to early 20th century. And in the early 20th century, especially in Calcutta, from where I come from, we had the Greater Indian Society. And the search for Greater India, we all know, produced a huge corpus of materials on India's cultural impact on Southeast Asia, something which has been also looked upon as the very foundation for analysts who now look into the region. And we find that this, to a large extent, can be explained by the anxiety on the part of the nationalist political leadership to locate India's position in the Pan-Asian matrix. And Pan-Asianism, in turn, raised very important issues like those of Indian diaspora, which scholars are now trying to address. Historicizing Look East, therefore, does not remain restricted to the elements of quote-unquote civilizational or cultural linkages that ancient India's maritime trade produced, but far more complex issues of contemporary times have also gone into the ways in which modern India imagines itself not only to be a part of the Asian world, but also as a part of the global world. Now, the past always has a relevance, and one cannot actually negate two great personalities, the ways in which they looked upon these societies, which were similar to the Indian society, at the same time very much different from the Indian society. Both of them shared an element of ambivalence. Tagore and Swami Vivekananda, both were almost very near contemporaries. Both men were modernists in some way or the other, and measured the East Asian or South Asian societies from the yardstick of Western modernity. And between China and Japan, Vivekananda regarded Japan as a more dynamic society which had adapted to modern technology. And China, in his terms, lagged behind Japan in the race for progress. Tagore's ideas, on the other hand, were very different, and the poet found the innovative spirit in Japan something what he described as a careful blending of Japanese tradition with modern influences. And all this is part of this great corpus of travel literature that one is familiar with. But then, these writings did not actually bring into focus the experiential traditions that were born out of the migration of the poor or the lower middle class influx into South Asia from different parts of India. And these were mostly people who went there in search of jobs in the plantations or in the mines. Something which is reflected in the writings of Bengali and Tamil literatures of modern times. And these have to be taken into consideration when we look into India's relations with South Asia, especially that of relations between the host country and the homeland. Now, India's relationship with East and Southeast Asia cannot be simply defined on the basis of migration of people or on the very fact that ideas were exchanged. The way, the processes through which such ideas traveled, interacted with one another, and actually created an element of hybridity is something which is very complex. Now, in the 19th century, the experience of Western colonialism certainly brought India closer to a larger part of East and Southeast Asia, which also went under a common canopy of political and economic domination. So India definitely has a shared destiny in these experiences and experiments with the eastern and southeastern parts of the subcontinent. Now, the Indian notion about Southeast Asia is definitely very, very different when you look into this background. From this background, when you see the Japanese notion of greater Asian prosperity, this entire model that the Japanese have, or the Chinese notion of all under heaven. We certainly, we talk in a different language. We project ourselves as motherland of Buddhism. We also talk about our great quote-unquote Hindu past. And certainly, whenever we talk about Southeast Asia, especially when you see it from the South Indian side, you will find that there is a lot of reference to Mahabodhi society. So you cannot really negate the role of Mahabodhi society. Now, all this went into the making of foreign policy. There are very, very different trajectories. Nehruvian India, as one speaker has alluded to, went through with the Bandung Conference. There were attempts to rally the ex-colonies, or to take, India tried to take a bigger role so far as the decolonized world was concerned. But this was fraught with certain uncertainties. We can certainly blame the Indian government for its inadequacies, for its weaknesses, but the circumstances were very different because Southeast Asia itself was in the middle of the Cold War, and the Southeast Asian nations were also divided in terms of bloc. They couldn't really decide whether to go for Russia or for America. And we find that this sort of indecision prevailed when Singapore actually decided to secede from Malaya. There was no real immediate reaction. The Indian government's reaction was also found to be wanting when in 1969 there were very, very serious clashes in Malaysia over involving the Indians and the Chinese. The reaction was very muted. At the same time, if you see in the 1970s, the differences between Cambodia and Kampuchea, India's stand was certainly very, very ambivalent. It didn't really know where to pitch in its ideas. And we continued in that state till about 1990s when this fresh winds of globalization and liberalization came. And we realized that our talk of this civilization would not really yield much ground. We had to back it up with some bit of real politics, whether it is political diplomacy or whether it is economic diplomacy. And certainly we had all these interactions with the Southeast Asian nations, and India itself was very envious. Why I use the term envious? Because this was also the time of the rise of the Asian tigers, the late 1990s and the early part of the 2000s. And certainly many Indian economists, policy planners felt that India could actually imitate the import substitution model, as we know, from Southeast Asia and even from countries like Taiwan, very close to Southeast Asia. But this brought us into a conflict with the Chinese, the maritime power. India had always been tested by the Chinese. There was intense conflict with the Chinese. And we find that India, I would have discussed a lot about Quad and other things since my previous speaker had alluded to them. I will cut short by saying that, yes, China is a big presence. And how do you deal with China? That's a $1 million question which cannot be answered that soon. We have rhetorics like make in India, made in India, and so on and so forth. Now, it is up to the government and it is up to the Indian people to back these statements. And unless and until we back these statements solidly with real action on our part, we cannot really build up a bloc against the Chinese. We have always said that from the north of the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Malacca, Indian Navy would patrol it. This has been the story from the 15th and the 16th century. One is clearly reminded of this great historian Sanjay Subramaniam. But we have always lost out. The real battle now, as Professor Mishra has alluded to, is how we take on the Chinese in the South China Sea and further into the Pacific. The glimmer of hope is that Prime Minister Modi has reiterated many times that we are going into this region, despite the deficiencies that we have. And I think he has made some correct moves. One has to take a position on that by trying to get into the Quad, by trying to rally with countries like Singapore, and moving to Fiji, which has a very, very significant Indian diaspora. The work of charting out this maritime and economic diplomacy is a difficult one because ASEAN is not one and the same. Southeast Asia is not one and the same. The rise of very rigid religious formations pose a challenge to the tranquil atmosphere of the ASEAN. So it is time that we also have to have a learning experience before we jump overboard and we say that we can be a part of ASEAN. Well, we were part of the observer group in ASEAN for some decades, but let us hope that we will be able to turn the tides this time. Thank you.
Now I would like to request our chairperson, Professor Smriti Kumar Sarkar sir, to give the closing remarks.
This is extremely a very relevant session because we live in contemporary times, and Professor Parhi has planned it in a way that a session is dedicated to the contemporary issues. And all the three speakers, I must say, I have done injustice to them, starting from Dr. Mistro, whose presentation I was telling him that it's so unique, so attractive to the audience in general, because we, the people from social science, doesn't have any idea of contemporary perspective so far as the strategic defense is concerned at the international level. And within very short time, he has placed us, situated us to a perspective that made me at least thinking. And his slides were really very, very interesting. And I'm sure that much story lies behind these slides, which he could have done justice to this subject, to the labor that he has put in preparing this presentation, if we could give him a little more time. And I was telling Rajshekhar that although I specially work on technology, the history of technology, but I am not in favor of this online presentation, really, because it makes many problems. When Dr. Abu Bakr was speaking, there was buzzing sound, there was echoing, and we cannot hear him properly. The little that I could make in from the presentation because of the technological snag was really also poised to a very significant perspective of the contemporary relationship in the among the Southeast Asian nations. So I think more of this presentation we could have in future when we plan this session, and I would request the enterprising person like Pari to rope in the financiers and the sponsors. There are, he knows he's a very powerful person, Pari, so you could rope in certain institutions by means of pooling the resources so that we can invite the foreign speakers here who have done really good work in this. I am sure Dr. Abu Bakr has also done a good work in his field, which maybe could be of much use to us who are working in this part of the, on this side of the sea, the Bay of Bengal. And finally, my brother, almost my brother, since I know him when he was just researchers, Raj Shekhar has raised certain very interesting issues. He reminds us of the Nehruvian idealism, how Nehru ran after certain ideals without any ground, without taking recognition or to certain ground issues, how the high hopes raised in Bandung were sunk deep in the Himalayan ice, and since then, how India lost her position, and the series of errors that were committed in the field of foreign policy during the first formative years of this young state democracy. In fact, many of the problems that we are facing, many of the strains that we are facing now are a contribution of those initial decades. But one significant point that Rajshekhar has made is that not only government initiative, fortunately, we are going through a very good time. After long back, this is also a divine situation where a thorough change has come in the field of foreign policy. For the first time, we see what I could say that it's an active foreign policy. In active foreign policy based on realities, based on ground situation. So, but apart from the government initiative, what is being insisted at the highest level of our national leadership is that people-to-people contacts are more interesting, are more useful. I was discussing with my Cambodian friend that it would have been better if I could get in touch with you some 10 years back, because he has been working on iron, and most of my research career, I spent on the iron technology and the iron tribes of India, the blacksmith tribes of India, and we don't know each other. So, so this sort of people-to-people exchange is important between the two sides of the Bay of Bengal, is important for a real reconstruction of the relationship that we had a millennium ago between these two sides. So the India-Southeast Asia civilizational connect, yesterday I was telling that we cannot date it when it began, but we can certainly reform it, revitalize it in newer fields, newer fields, and Dr. Abu Bakr was referring to the software, the Indian software power. And there are similar other areas where both the people, all the nations in this region could benefit. And I hope that we, being it is the last session. So I think let us conclude from this session that this conference, the second conference, let us hope that when we meet next time, we have more of this people's participation and more research interaction between the two sides of the Bay of Bengal. With that hope, I conclude my best wishes to all the paper presenters here, Dr. Mistro, Dr. Abu Bakr, and Professor Rajshekhar Bose. I hope all of them will continue their research in this field and will write something positive that will help the young generations. Thank you.
I would now like to request our organizers to felicitate the chairperson and the speakers. Professor Upendra Padi, sir. Sir, please felicitate the chairperson as well as the speakers. Now it's time for the vote of thanks. This session was extremely enlightening and insightful for all of us. I would like to extend my heartfelt regards to and thanks to the chairperson, Professor Smriti Kumar Sarkar sir, the speakers, Dr. Abu Bakar Ebihara, Dr. Subhranshu Shekhar Mishra, and Dr. Raj Shekhar Basu. I would also like to thank the esteemed dignitaries present here and the audience for the patient hearing. Thank you everyone. Have a good day ahead. So I have an announcement to make that we will be beginning with the closing ceremony at 11 o'clock, the valedictory ceremony.